Assassin's Creed Black Flag might be one of the best pirated games, sailing included, that you might have missed due to the shifting technology of the time, or just simply due to how old it is now. Launched in 2013, Black Flag became a favorite game of many pirate fans with flashy and effective combat and a sailing system that made ship-to-ship combat and all that came after it, such as the boarding and looting experience, a killer experience like no other. While Ubisoft Montreal, the main developer behind the Assassin's Creed series, was behind Black Flag, they had some assistance from a little-known studio, Ubisoft Singapore. Ubisoft Singapore would actually design the sailing itself, which they would then take heavy inspiration from, including Black Flag itself as a game, in an attempt to make their own unique Quadruple A new IP, Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones might be one of the most interesting projects on the series yet, with a lengthy history of delays, scope switches, and a slew of talent departures, and much more.
Jared, I'm here to tell you that I'm quitting.
While Skull and Bones would launch February 2024, that was after a mountain of delays and total direction changes. Skull and Bones was then mostly forgotten, as most fans moved on from the game before it ever even came out. But worse, because the game itself turned out to be quite forgettable as well. Despite having $200 million on a budget and over 8 years of development, Skull and Bones would already lose the majority of their player base, especially on Xbox, just months after launch. And so, detectives, what went wrong? Why did this high-profile, high-dollar Quadruple A project fail so epically and so quickly following its launch? Well, as the experienced detectives know, we have a litany of clues to uncover through the use of a timeline of events that unfold over the course of the video. This all culminates in the final deduction, where we gather both clues and evidence alike and crack the case. Grab the sails, though, detectives. We have piracy afoot. Thank you to Encore for sponsoring this video. Encore is a marketplace for retro video games and collectibles that emphasizes trust, community, and entertainment. Sellers post 30 to 60 second clips of their products for sale, either as auctions or buy now listings. Shipping labels are provided within the app, and once you make a sale, you just simply go to your profile, sold tab, and generate a label. The app even has video auctions, which can last up to 7 days. And of course, the classic buy now offers too. There's even a live chat on the auctions using the app. Encore is the place to learn about and shop for retro video games. Real collectors will tell you about the games they are selling, and many will even show you gameplay recordings too. The auctions on Encore can get crazy on some of their rare items. With last item bids flying in and lots of trash talking in chat, you could even find some friends or some enemies. Encore takes trust and safety seriously, with all sellers being ID verified, and protects you when your items come, not as described. Encore also has great customer service in case you have an issue with your auction. There's a ton of giveaways on the app that are completely free to enter, and Encore even pays for giveaway shipping, so you don't have to pay for anything. Once you've entered a giveaway, you can even get 5 extra entries per friend you bring in to join in on the giveaway. This can increase your odds of winning just by sharing your link with friends. Speaking of links, use my link in the description below to download Encore on your iOS or Android device using the App Store and check out the awesome giveaways going on there. The story begins with the early history of the studio, Ubisoft Singapore. Ubisoft, a French major developer founded over 35 years ago, would found a studio in Singapore, citing the openness of the country to international trade. Ubisoft Singapore was largely known for remaking existing games, such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time Reshelled, that's a mouthful, and naturally, many Assassin's Creed games, in which they would help assist with development on, such as things like asset production and some challenge design. The first project that would hit big for the company was Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which would launch in October of 2013. Ubisoft rewarded developers based on bonus structures. When attached to successful games, they would make more money, and thus the success of Black Flag, which sold a whopping 15 million copies, heavily rewarded Ubisoft Singapore. There's tons of videos on this impressive game, but without exaggeration, it's probably one of the best pirate games that you can play. The only downside being that it wasn't really multiplayer, at least not in the same way that the piracy functioned in single player. Multiplayer was actually just for the land-based modes. This idea, alongside the success that they would achieve from Black Flag in general, would lead Ubisoft Singapore to make a major move in 2013. Attempting to shed their little sister studio status in the process, they would begin development on a title initially known as Black Flag Infinite, designed to be a live service multiplayer game that would essentially repurpose assets and aspects of Black Flag into a multiplayer game. The problems started occurring right away though. For starters, Ubisoft Singapore had never developed their own game before, and were trying to make quite the ambitious project now. This could be seen in how much time they spent on design documents coming up with ideas for Black Flag Infinite. There were ideas of multiplayer Rainbow Six style shooter boat combat, Sid Meier's Pirates, a Civilization style strategy game with pirates and ships, and even an open world online piracy experience. Now, shopping ideas, especially as an already established team, isn't that strange, but according to major reports from Kotaku, these decisions and directions would change on a whim, eating up precious time and resources even early on. Originally known as Black Flag Infinite, major production would start in the summer of 2015 with over 100 developers working on the project, and alongside it, a name change would accompany it, and focus change too. Black Flag Infinite would become Project Liberté, which was set to be its own unique AAA IP now separate from the Assassin's Creed series. The reason for this is quite simple. Technology had shifted at the time, which was the Xbox One and PlayStation 3 launching in 2013. That's because despite Black Flag launching on those consoles as well later on, it was actually designed for the previous console, making it quite dated quickly. Fast forward a few years, already 4 years after its initial development was started, and you start to see the first reveal of the new pirate project, now going as Skull and Bones. At E3 2017, Ubisoft would reveal that Skull and Bones was a game that took place in a systemic world where you could solo sail or team up with other friends and players and form a gang. Taking place in the Indian Ocean, this would give players a fresh setting and plenty of piracy opportunities. However, alarm bells were already going off for those that were savvy, because the version of the game actually showcased a 5 vs 5 multiplayer shooter mode dubbed Loot Hunt instead of this open world pirate game that they were promising. Ubisoft Singapore would assure everybody though that that version of the game was still being worked on and it was still going to be incredibly ambitious. But all that was shown so far was just a loot style shooter with boats, which meant that the game now was focusing more on ship combat solely. By 2018, this promised ambitious online pirate game actually started to take some real form, at least sort of. Skull and Bones would show up with a new poop deck and now actually showcase a game capable of cooperative play to take down enemy warships. It played something like The Division's Dark Zone, where you could loot hideouts, fight players, or work together to take down some powerful bosses. This version looks a lot more like Black Flag's sailing system, and with a more tactical and weighty approach to combat and movement that the game was kind of known for. Lead technical art director Chris Kirkpatrick would state that we wanted to do the biggest pirate and naval open world game that we could do. It seemed like as the years started to build up, the idea for what Skull and Bones was supposed to be kept just growing exponentially. While I don't think that increasing your ambitions on an online project is inherently bad, doing it too much can ever expand your scope and make you end up like games like Star Citizen, with a lot of cool ass tech, but mostly promises still, and a launch date who knows when. This is exactly the same issue that Skull and Bones would have, now reaching 5 years of development and a few boat switches. Skull and Bones, however, following this call for ambition, would be delayed to 2019, and maybe even potentially 2020, which is strange because who isn't sure when the game's going to be delayed for whenever you're releasing such information? By 2019, Skull and Bones was still on the fritz, yet getting promised a TV show? At this point too, 400 developers were working on this incredibly ambitious project, with many other Ubisoft studios even offering assistance at times. In 2019, Skull and Bones would noticeably be absent from E3 2019, which was because it was delayed until 2020. According to behind-the-scenes reports from Kotaku, that was because the open-world piracy idea was kind of scrapped in favor of something closer to a survival game, like Rust or Ark, with resource management, crafting, and trading. However, the Anvil engine from Ubisoft, was ill-equipped for resource gathering mechanics. That's why the game would have yet another vision change by the next year of 2020. This is the year that they promised to launch yet again. Skull and Bones would then take the assassin form from the previous IP they were borrowing from and not be shown to the public for a number of years after this new vision was promised, clearly showing that the game was being nearly scrapped again. In 2020, another issue would rear its ugly head regarding Skull and Bones and its development team, and that was because the project had a history of losing top talent because they would either move on to other Ubisoft projects or get poached by other top development studios. Ubisoft Singapore lost game directors, producers, creative leads, all during the process of its multiple refocuses. Examples of this being the team losing multiple creative directors, now like Elizabeth Pellin, which I know she's French, but I can't pronounce French names, who sadly got memed for being unintelligible when speaking at events, but was the former VP of editorial at Ubisoft's Paris office. Wait, what? That means that they went from being in charge of like print publication to a creative lead on a project in game development? Sorry, but the pipeline just doesn't really make sense. That being said, Pellin would actually steer the ship not so badly, with a desire to refocus the game into the open-world piracy idea that they kind of abandoned back in 2018. Problem being, anytime Ubisoft Singapore would now receive feedback from the main office in Paris regarding this idea, they would start freaking out and changing everything about the game and even shifting people that were working on things around. After a deep dive, you can see that Ubisoft Singapore isn't really rated very high on Glassdoor, a website that's famous for having employee reviews. There are complaints that the studio was not competitive with things like salaries, and that people suffered from wage and sexual discrimination and harassment. They even had toxic managers and senior management. This senior management would surround themselves with yes men, according to the Kotaku report, and then sell the Paris HQ back home false promises on what was being delivered. This toxic culture would easily contribute to many of the woes of the struggling pirate project, which many felt was supposed to just be a slam dunk, since Black Flag already was. Skull and Bones would officially announce their restart of development in the summer of 2021. This was done to facilitate the new, old direction change. Also alongside this update would be news that Skull and Bones would be delayed yet again, this time putting the game in the 8+ year development time window. However, after much delay and scope growth and change, Skull and Bones would finally be playable August 2022 in the form of a closed beta. And this is where the official glaze starts to happen from outlets like IGN. Now, to be fair, seeing anything at this point probably felt positive to them. But the problem was, you could already see the issues of Skull and Bones even early on, which is why the comment section of the IGN Impressions video doesn't match the tone of the video. You read many complaints about how the game was now lacking any sort of melee combat or interactivity, or even just boarding mechanics, and how the combat largely looked and moved arcadey, almost like it was designed for like a competitive shooter. When ships shoot and are shot, you see massive explosions now, almost like cartoonish level ones, instead of the classic wood splintering and cascading waves you would hear in Black Flag. Speaking of which, the waves in Skull and Bones made little to no noise at all, which was utterly bizarre. Also distinctly missing was the lack of your crew cheering every victory, an iconic part of Black Flag. Regardless if the game was ready, there were rumors that Ubisoft Singapore didn't have a choice anymore but to launch regarding a law with the Singaporean government due to them receiving government money to form a game studio there. Skull and Bones would finally launch 11 years after it first began its development, February 16th, 2024. As if that wasn't already a hurdle to overcome, the game was now being priced at $70, and the CEO of Ubisoft proper was defending this price, calling the game a Quadruple A project worthy of a price tag and a live service game model, complete with a cash shop, putting crazy standards and even more negative publicity surrounding the game. On aggregate review website Metacritic, Skull and Bones, the Quadruple A title, would score a mere 59 out of 100 from 50 different critics. Eurogamer, in their quite negative review of the game, would state that when the introductory pre-rendered FMV video doesn't even play smoothly, doubts will arise about the quality of this endeavor before you've even played it. This sequence also reveals that a vast array of Ubisoft studios contributed to the game, so the budget was clearly there, and obviously there was no shortage of time spent on the project either. And yet that Quadruple A investment has not delivered anything like a polished or even enjoyable end product. The Guardian would state that Skull and Bones might attract sea combat enthusiasts, but that it was more of a trade and naval battle simulator game than a proper pirate game. Overall, the critical reception is pretty glazy still. I'm not going to mince words. This is especially compared to the fan reception of the game, which was as low as 30% out of 100. The contrast here can be explained simply, and that's because media outlets continue to make this mistake despite decades in the space. Value, or the need to buy a game full price, is rarely mentioned in such reviews, making them kind of largely trite when you have to fork over $70 and hope the game has a future when it already lacks so much. Remember, outlets are getting review copies for free. So thus, outlets might be more positive because they're not worried about this value exchange, and they're done with the game after they review it. But players who are continuously going to be playing the game will be nickeled and dimed in the process, in the case of Skull and Bones, all the while feeling like they were sold a game that wasn't anything like the one they were originally promised, and thus not the one that they wanted. And it was $70. While Skull and Bones, all things considered, wasn't actually horrible, there are certainly some cool aspects in it, like the fact that it's an open world game that's supposed to be like a pirate game, and even the gameplay loop isn't even that bad or anything. The issue is that there isn't any weight to anything in Skull and Bones. You're just gathering from your ship by playing this silly little mini game where your ship supposedly uses the tools that you had to craft for some reason to then gather resources as a ship. It either feels like a relic from a previous idea just left in, or not a fully fleshed out one. And worse, when you reach land, which you can actually do, it's like the Sea of Thieves outpost approach, where you can't fight and the only things that you can do are chat to NPCs, craft, and trade. Problem being that Sea of Thieves, which we neglected to mention up until now in the video, which I feel like is kind of impressive, was a direct competitor to Skull and Bones and offered a far less lonely multiplayer experience filled with a less serious and more of a goofy approach to gameplay. Yet it very much was a pirate game, with the ability to board and loot enemy player ships, as well as the NPC ones. And Sea of Thieves had more than just outposts without combat. That was just one part of the game. You could also attack NPC bases and use all the combat tools at your disposal. In Skull and Bones, you couldn't, even though it was based on Black Flag, which, remember everybody, was an Assassin's Creed game. You couldn't even really be a pirate then. What pirate was not known for boarding ships and using close quarters combat, swashbucklerly and all, to fell their targets? All things that you expect from Pirates of the Caribbean, all things that you could do in Sea of Thieves, and packaged in that game for an audience that was way younger even. Skull and Bones might have filled a niche for some players, more interested in the realistic looking ships, but the problem is the physics in Sea of Thieves are more realistic than the Skull and Bones physics. Sure, you might like the look of one game over the other, but that's not the only point here. Skull and Bones ships plays like a shooter and a hero shooter, with the ability to fire and turn your ships and cannons on a dime. This was contrasted to the original Black Flag gameplay, which was actually fairly tactical, with the payoff of actually being able to loot the ships that you defeated and fight with them in close quarters combat. But even the early Skull and Bones footage from 2018 showcased a game closer to this. I don't know why the direction change was to turn Skull and Bones more into a pseudo naval action modern game, but I think it was ultimately misguided when the game's focus was on being a multiplayer game. Though at the very least, you could play alone if you wanted, or team up with 4 other players, on a map of up to 20 players total. However, in a bizarre way, you could only attack the other player ships during world events, which were limited and random, making the game even more puzzling as a supposed pirate game. These bizarre design decisions and the overall lackluster package of Skull and Bones itself, despite the hefty price tag, would be reflected in the game's subpar player base at launch, and its strong loss of players even months after launch. While Skull and Bones would lose a third of the population just a month after launch, they would lose 90% of their Xbox population by May of 2024. The game also reportedly had under 1 million players, which was also including the trial players in those numbers. There was simply no possible way that Ubisoft had recouped their losses on the game, which had reportedly cost them $200 million. Even if all 800,000 of the players bought the game full price, that's not even close to what's needed. In fact, they would still need another $144 million to do so. Skull and Bones would announce a content roadmap that, although didn't look horrible for year 1, would feature much anticipated major features such as new major feature. It's like they didn't even know what they wanted to add to the game yet, and yet we're trying to convince people with a live service content model regardless. Year 2 would be announced on April 15th of 2025, and although many, myself included, were surprised that they were even still updating the game, especially given how small the player base was reportedly, the update itself for Year 2 clearly starts to show some more cracks in the armor, because it showcases a shrinking in scope and a lackluster overall game value proposition. I mean, the game was getting a reputation system, something that even the bare bones launch of Sea of Thieves had, which they then managed to take and turn around to something very successful. Worse, just look at the roadmap. You can clearly see that simply less is being promised with the game, and when that starts to happen on a lackluster live service game, it faces even a slower death, as the content can be pretty much forecasted for the next year to be even slimmer pickings. It's not like they can course correct. Steeped in managerial issues and a total lack of direction, Skull and Bones, or at least the version of it that ultimately launched, was a regression on expectations of its fans, and especially a regression even compared to the classic Black Flag game, which was now 12 plus years old. I think that's the ultimate damning part of it all. That regardless of the various name changes and scope changes, that Skull and Bones was always going to be compared to the game that it was, well, originally based on. Sadly though, that Black Flag was better than what we got with Skull and Bones. And besides the already listed reasons, we have even more of them. Black Flag has a full campaign, meanwhile Skull and Bones canceled theirs during development. But there's more. S&B had terrible cutscenes and was only able to sell a quarter of what Sea of Thieves launch numbers were, a title that now sold over 5 million units and reached 25 million players total. But just imagine though, what if Black Flag Online actually was a thing? I mean, Black Flag sold 15 million full-priced games. What if Black Flag Online was free to play? I think it easily would have reached the same amount of players as Sea of Thieves, if not more based on projections. That's really the last dagger in the story, detectives. That Black Flag really was a home run idea when placed in an online format. But just because it was a home run, so to say, didn't mean that it was going to be easy to execute into a multiplayer game, especially by a super inexperienced game developer. We very likely will still see another game attempted something like this, but that's simply due to how exciting of a prospect it is to have this massive player base of players ready to just pillage the seas. I mean, again, we mentioned Pirates of the Caribbean before, but that massive fan base has been waiting for a game to mimic that kind of stuff for ages. With that music playing, detectives, it means that this case has come to a close, and while Skull and Bones is still alive, I'm confident that it has scurvy so bad around it that most players wouldn't even bother to come back to it, even if they remade it again in another patch. On top of that, it's been a colossal failure for Ubisoft, being over a $144 million loss for them. Although their recent Assassin's Creed title Shadows is on par to do quite well sales-wise, Ubisoft had a terrible 2024 and was cited as desperately needing a win. Both Star Wars Outlaws and Skull and Bones were cited as the major reasons for the company's failure. Skull and Bones wasn't just on the fritz, Ubisoft as a company, for the first time in like ages, or maybe even ever, was. Something I have to say before we list out our largest contributing factors for the game's failure, in case you weren't paying attention to the clues along the way, is why? Why did Ubisoft Singapore get so much rope? Even if they are being managed all the while, it just doesn't make sense. How does the scope get so far away from the original idea that you end up making a worse game 11 years later? How did Ubisoft allow such a thing to happen, though, I guess is the bigger question. And so, why did Skull and Bones fail so hard? Overpromised and underdelivered. A poor value proposition. Live service Quadruple A. Delayed over 5 times over the course of an 11-year development cycle. Why was a little sister studio given so much rope? Lack of a game direction and poor studio management. Worse than the game that it was supposed to elevate. Skull and Bones might be one of the highest profile failures we've ever seen, especially from Ubisoft, but it's one of the many live service failures of late to launch in the past couple of years, and not even Ubisoft's first one. In fact, as Ubisoft Montreal found themselves failing with Hyperscape only just a few years prior. My point is that Ubisoft is not the only company failing to understand that rushing to design the perfectly designed money-making online game is not what excites the player base. Instead, they want to actually play good online games that happen to be live service. Even Square Enix has some massive failures of late too. And until these major developers like Ubisoft aren't able to realize the error in their ways in an incredible never-thought-before sense, they could actually go kaput. There isn't such a thing as being too big to fail, and Skull and Bones was proof of that alone. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments your thoughts on Skull and Bones, and if you would like to see a Black Flag-esque pirate game in the future. Now, until the next case.
Venus?